assuming that you get what you're talking about in terms of legislation, it would still be possible for an individual to board a domestic flight without showing ID, and yet somebody else in the terminal could be approached by your officers if they don't ask for ID, and as you pointed out, wouldn't need reasonable suspicion. Just the police chose to ask them, and they don't have ID. They're not boarding a plane, and what consequences would that have if they didn't have ID?
Well, that's to be worked out in the legislation, of course, as to what a penalty may be if somebody is not able to satisfy the police officer of their identification. So I can't answer that, Senator, because it's still as part of the drafting of the bill.
So my assumption of the options would be that it might be an offence not to be able to provide ID. It might be that they can't remain in the airport; they're compelled to leave.
To move on, yes.
Or they might be told they can't fly, which is sort of a subset of the can't remain in the airport. So you could have somebody who is flying, does fly, and checks in, boards without showing any ID whatsoever, and yet another person who's got no intention of flying is simply in the airport, can't, or somebody who is not required to show their ID in order to fly, but because they're asked before they even check in for their ID and can't provide it, they can't fly. It's a bit bizarre, isn't it?
I'm not going to comment on whether it's bizarre or not, but what you've just worked through...
Well, that was the only question, Commissioner, and it's really something you can't comment on.
Senator, this is a risk-based measure that we are suggesting.
Yeah. My travels internationally, I don't think I can recall any other country, perhaps with the exception of New Zealand, where it's possible to check in on a domestic flight without showing ID. Wouldn't that be a reasonable first step?
That you shouldn't be able to travel domestically without... Well, that's not a question for me. That's a matter for airline policy and for a discussion with the government about...
Is that not a risk-based option?
Well, as I said earlier, Senator, that I believe what we are proposing here is a balanced, measured law that will not curtail freedom of movement through the airports, that will not change the fundamental basis of domestic travel at the moment, but provide police with a risk-based measure that we can deal with some of those vulnerabilities.